Hello, I'm Courtney. Welcome to my channel where we discuss educational research one study at a time so that you can incorporate it into your practice. Well, grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you're having, or just grab that stack of duotangs that needs to be filled, and I will chat with you while you work. So today's topic is an equity topic. The article is called Redefining Teacher, Preservice Teachers with Disabilities in Canadian Teacher Education Programs. Okay, so this study is all about teachers with disabilities, or should I say the lack of teachers with disabilities that represent our teaching force compared to the wider society. The authors in this study looked at pre-service teachers rather than actual teachers that have a contract already. Now, this is important because there is a gap between who's in our faculties of ed and who actually makes it to getting hired into a full-time teaching contract or a teaching contract. Teaching candidates are also easier to access because if you're a university researcher in a faculty of education, you also teach students who are in the faculty of education. So they're right there at your fingertips to study. And so the authors in this study wanted to learn more about pre-service teachers and specifically those with disabilities and how that all works. What are their struggles in the university, in their teaching practicums and all of that. So to build their case, the authors started off with a review of literature and looked at what's already out there. What they found was that teacher candidates or pre-service teachers have two choices when it comes to living with a disability and trying to navigate a pre-service teaching program. The first choice that they can make is to disclose their disability. And when that happens, there are supports in place, at least where the study is conducted, there are supports in place to accommodate them. But there's also the whole thing of being treated differently, being treated with skepticism that comes with it. It's really a risk benefit. The other option is to hide your disability. You don't get any of the supports, but you also don't get any of the stigma that goes with it. So we would love to live in a world where we say, yes, everybody, like if you have a disability, tell us and we will accommodate you. But obviously the reality of how that plays out isn't a safe reality, or else people wouldn't feel like they had to choose between disclosing and not disclosing. There wouldn't be a risk-benefit analysis to do there. There would only be benefits. Not the case. Then the researchers talk about the theory that they use to approach this topic. So they use the Constructionist Theory. Basically what it entails is an understanding that people come to a context with information already available to them. So they're bringing their own knowledge and building, constructing the culture that they're in or the setting that they're in. So it's a strengths-based approach, which is important. The authors also are looking at their research through social hierarchy theory, which is showing that basically that able-bodied people have an unearned dominance over people who are disabled. So then the authors in this study talked a little bit about the hidden curriculum. If you would like to learn more about all of that, I can link a video up here. It's all about schools perpetuating norms and values and sort of the underlying curriculum. So the authors talk about the hidden curriculum, and then after building their argument with the research that's already been done, the authors have this to say. The inclusion and education of teachers with disabilities is just emerging into the consciousness of researchers, faculties of education, and school officials. Isn't that terrible? It's just occurring to us now to think that maybe we should be doing something to support teachers with disabilities. We think schools are such happy, magical, equitable places. But when you read things like that, I mean, come on. Let's get into how this research was conducted. The authors in this study attended a conference where they were going to be among all of the directors of pre-service teaching, of student teaching. And so the authors attended that conference, chatted with everybody, and invited all of the directors back to have focus groups after the conference had ended. So in real life, you would invite somebody like, hey, come on back to my place after this party and we'll have some coffee and hang out. In the research world, it's like, hey, how's it going? Come on back to my place after and we'll do some focus groups. That's how we're making our connections. The authors met with the directors of student teaching that agreed to be part of the study. They had 14 people who agreed to come in total. And from there, they had 4 major findings. And I'll go into detail about them. But the main 4 findings that they found were the type of disability had an impact on their confidence in terms of their legal and ethical decision making in terms of placing this student teacher with a disability into a practicum setting. Many of the directors used a team approach when they were deciding how they wanted to place a student into a practicum situation. In order to accommodate a student with a disability, the directors really were relying on disclosure. They really needed students to disclose that there was some kind of a disability before the practicum started. And then after the disclosure, the directors did acknowledge that there were sometimes some hard decisions to be made. And then the last finding was that many of the directors agreed that not everybody can be a teacher, but there was mixed thoughts on whether or not a disability would prevent a student from being successful in their practicum, so in their pre-service teaching. So there's a difference between finishing your practicum and making it successfully through school and then going on to get a job in teaching. Some really interesting findings that the authors noticed were that, for example, the standards that are used to certify teachers were implemented really rigidly when it came to students with disabilities. And there was a mismatch between what was needed to certify a teacher and what was needed for a teacher once they were already hired. So, for example, a lot of certification boards wouldn't certify teachers for working part-time in a practicum. And obviously, if a student has a disability, having the ability to work part-time can make the difference between being able to attend or not. And so certification boards wouldn't certify a part-time teaching student. However, in the real world of teaching, there are many teachers who are part-time teachers. And so there's a mismatch there because you're saying that working part-time means that you wouldn't be competent enough to be a teacher. Certification is judging your competency. But then you know that there's competent teachers and they work part-time. And so there's no caveat to those standards that say an accommodation for this includes allowing part-time certification if you can prove it on paperwork or something like that. Another finding was that directors had a hard time connecting with practicum schools. They really relied on connections with schools in order to find placements for their student teachers. And if that relationship was strained, then it could burn bridges for future practicum placements. So here's where it gets tricky though if you're the student teacher. If you have a disability and you disclose that you have a disability, then your director is going to disclose to the school that you have a disability or that you might need some kind of accommodation or whatever, then the school can be resistant and say, no, we don't want that. But if you don't disclose and you get placed and then you don't do well in your practicum because you're exhausted, because you're sick, or you can't get to the classroom because it's on the second level, well, then they're going to say, hey, why didn't you tell us? And so either way, it ends up negatively having an impact on the student teacher. We're not really looking so good here as a profession. If schools are saying we don't want student teachers who have a learning disability, we don't want student teachers who can't use the staircase. Wow, we are not looking so good as a profession that claims to care about all humans. All right, so some more of the findings were that some of the directors took it upon themselves to find very specific placements for students that they need. So this might be a school that had a teaching force that was a lot more flexible, or at a school that wasn't quite as difficult as some of the other schools that they had in their catchment area. That's strange. I thought all schools were equal and had a teaching staff that maintained a culture of caring and welcoming people. Weird. Other directors talked about trying to encourage students with disabilities to go into non-certified programs that the school offered. Now, this isn't offered everywhere, but in the area that was studied, they had non-certified programs where the students might be more successful in. So the authors did a good job here of interviewing really the gatekeepers between a student and their dreams, right? If a student, a teacher candidate. So if a teacher candidate wants to be a teacher, they really are relying on the benevolence and the accommodations offered by the director of student teaching at the faculty of education that they go to. So it really is one person who could make or break it for this student in terms of just getting in the door. This gatekeeper status showed in the interviews. One of the directors talked about completely dismantling the idea of abled and disabled and turning more towards an approach of universal design for learning, where you would set up student teaching so that it's more equitable and accessible for everybody, and that benefits students who have disabilities, but it also helps the students who don't have disabilities. And so this director was really optimistic and had a really open approach to working with students and encouraging them on their journey of becoming a teacher. Other directors of student teaching were not as benevolent, and so one of them said, well, this is the job, this is what teaching is, and if you can't do it, you can't do it. It's not for everybody. And of course, we've heard this argument before, but the authors cite research showing that teachers with disabilities are not incompetent. There are incompetent teachers, but having a disability doesn't make you incompetent. And so there are ways to be very successful as a teacher, and when you look at the outcomes for students, there are no differences between a competent teacher who's disabled and a competent teacher who's able-bodied. There are no academic differences for the students, and so that needs to be remembered and brought to the forefront of this kind of a discussion. One of the directors also said, maybe teaching isn't for this particular student, but they can go find another job that still lets them work with kids. And I find this argument very demeaning. The fact that, first of all, we all just want to be teachers because we love children. There are other ways to be drawn to the profession. Yes, you should like kids, but kids are humans, and if you're working with humans, you should like humans. But there are other reasons why people love being a teacher. They might love the subject matter, they might love the environment, they might love the creative aspect of it. So just saying go find another job to work with kids is a very narrow view of teachers. If we all just needed to like kids to get a job in teaching, then a lot more people would be teachers. So there is a skill set that's being ignored there. The other problem I have with that statement is that this is somebody's livelihood. You're talking about somebody's livelihood and deciding that they don't deserve that livelihood. And that means that you're saying that they don't deserve a permanent kind of contract that comes with benefits associated with the job that could provide for them when they are experiencing illness or disability. You're keeping people from developing a safety net so that they can thrive in this world because you won't open up your point of view on what a teacher needs to look like. Are you kidding me? The authors in this study tended to focus more of their attention on the positive things that the directors said, and I understand this because they were relying on those directors that they probably have a relationship with to provide information. So they can't necessarily drag all of the directors of student teaching through the mud, and they should focus a lot on, for example, the person who talked about universal design for learning and those who had a very generous approach to working with people who have disabilities. However, the negative things that were said are still pervasive in our society, or else we would have a teaching force that was representative of people with disabilities. The authors conclude that the directors of student teaching in general view the concept of a teacher as malleable and something that can be changed and something that they can work with, even if the certifications surrounding who gets to be a teacher are so rigid. And the authors also conclude that the directors of student teaching felt that if they could get the students certified, then they could help contribute to a more equitable teaching landscape, which is absolutely what we want. The conclusions that the authors draw, however, don't match up to all of the data that they presented. Their conclusions tend to focus more on the positive data, which I understand is useful in inspiring people to take these steps moving forward so that we can change the context that student teachers find themselves in. However, the conclusions should also state that there are some huge pervasive biases when we're talking about people with disabilities that are still continuing today and are the reason why our school systems don't meet the needs of every single student because we don't have a teaching force that represents every single student. So overall, I think this is a good study in that it's getting the ball rolling on discussion. I do think we need a lot more work to be done. We need to move from just talking about teacher candidates to also talking about teachers. I know that from a research stance, that's a lot harder to do. It's harder to talk to teachers because of ethics and things like that, but it's not impossible, and it's worth it, and our students are worth it, and our teachers are worth it. So what can we do about this? If we're just a lowly teacher or an administrator, what can we do to bring in people with disabilities to make our teaching force more representative? Well, if you are a teacher or an administrator and you have a partnership with a faculty of education, call them up and say that you have a certain number of student teaching spots available reserved only for student candidates with disabilities. And if there are no teacher candidates with disabilities, that's fine. Maybe you don't take on students that year, but make a point to say that if you have a teacher candidate with a disability, we would love to have them here. And then help that student, that teacher candidate, be successful so that they can pass through their program and get hired later on. Write them a recommendation, accommodate them in whatever way you can so that we can change the landscape of teaching. My other hope is that with everybody shifted to online learning and remote learning, that this opens up opportunities for teachers with disabilities. Because if we have remote teaching as an option, which provides flexibility to students, then hopefully it can provide the same flexibility to teachers who have disabilities. So if you are the director of a school board, or if you are somebody who is making the policy in your area, then perhaps make some of the teaching spots that are designated as remote learning spots, designate those as this is reserved for a teacher with a disability because we think it can be beneficial for them. We have to just stop talking about things and start actually doing some things. And we know that if we contribute to a more representative teaching force, that our students will be able to see themselves better reflected in their curriculum that they interact with every day, and we will stop missing gaps in meeting their needs because we'll have teachers that'll say, hold on a minute, I've noticed that when a student returns from being sick, they have a whole stack of work on their desk. Here's how disability and illness actually work. Let's talk about how we can support this student. So there is so much value in lived experience, especially from equity-seeking groups, and we need to start taking some steps forward to serve them better. Well, that is all I have for you today. Please give this video a like and share it with a colleague that you think might find it interesting. I would also love if you would subscribe so that we can build a community and discuss educational research together. And if you have anything else that you would like me to cover, please leave it in the comments down below. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye!